Hi, Josh, and
Hello.
welcome to the Vulnerability Rocks podcast. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. It's good to be here. I'm excited.
I don't tend to ask people too much before I meet them because I like to meet you real time. I like to discover you real time and to hear your story, hopefully for the first time for me,
hmm
so that the listeners and myself, we will hear it all together.
hmm
So, Josh, tell me about you because I saw a post that you put up about, um, was it 2012?
2012, yeah.
Yeah.
2012, yeah.
And how your life has kind of radically transformed since then, but also your awareness of what was going on, what was the real reason. So that's as much as I'm going to say. And I'd like you now to tell me about you.
Okay, so I guess, you mentioned 2012. That was the post that you saw. And I guess that's when my life began to change in the way that it has. Okay, so I went from living my life a certain way to now being on this journey of what I would call healing. Okay, so 2012, what happened was is at that stage of my life, I would have felt like I felt like I was brave and strong and courageous and all of these things. I showed up to life in a certain way. I had a certain idea of what made me be a man. And I found myself at the age of 24 years old, um, having a complete emotional breakdown. I recognized at that stage that I'd had a serious problem with alcohol and the way in which I used it. Um, and I decided on the 14th of May 2012 that maybe alcohol was my problem, and I decided to quit alcohol. But for me, what happened when I quit alcohol is that my life emotionally then just completely fell apart. It was almost like, in a way, alcohol was the last thing that was holding me together, despite it being one of the things that was pulling me apart.
Mm-hmm.
And once I stopped alcohol, I started to feel like my life was completely empty. I now recognize I was having panic attacks. Felt like I didn't want to be here anymore. I had 4 children at the time already, a failed marriage. I was in £17,000 of debt, and I was back living on a fold-out bed in my mum's house. And after 9 months of not drinking anymore, I reached a stage when I felt like I didn't want to be here. And so I made what felt like a very conscious and selfless decision to take my own life. And I went to see my children for what I thought was going to be the last time. And because I knew I was gone, I knew I was leaving this world, the past became irrelevant and the future became like non-existent. And for the first time ever in my life, I felt a sense of presence with my children that I'd never sensed before. And I remember cuddling my daughter and feeling it in a way that I'd never experienced before in my life. And what happened is that I changed my mind. And not only did I change my mind, I realized that my problem, what was killing me, was coming from inside of me. And after that weekend, I then switched to being on this journey that I'm now on, which is like my healing journey of understanding where all that came from. And what I recognized is that, some of the realizations over the period of the last 8 years that I've had is I'm a highly sensitive person. I feel things deeply. I struggle with my emotions. Basically, everything that I thought would make me weak is what I am and is what I've began to find strength in. So that's kind of a short overview, so that I'm not here so we don't fill up the full hour of me just telling you my story, because I could absolutely do that. I'll unpack it slowly as you kind of pick it apart. But that's kind of, and then the turnaround from being where I was is that I now deliver resilience training, emotional resilience training to organizations around the world. And I've had the opportunity to do that in some amazing places. I've worked, like I say, just today, I've worked in Southeast Asia and across Europe, delivering from the comfort of my office. But I've passionate about working with schools as well. I work with children as young as 5 and 6 years old around emotional resilience. And I also work with police forces and fire services and stuff like that. So the change in the last 8 years has been huge in what I've been through. And it's all come from leaning into my emotions instead of running away from them.
So I love what you said there about everything that you actually are, that you've kind of stepped into and realized that this is me, or all of the things that you thought were weaknesses before, but now you realize they're your strengths.
Yeah.
And I can really relate. I can relate to that a lot. Can we go back? So going back to, you say you were drinking a lot, up until that point where you decided to stop, and then you feel like everything unraveled. When you were in that space where you were drinking, just very quickly, give me a picture of what that lifestyle looked like for you. You say you had 3 kids, did you say 4 kids?
4 kids, yeah.
So how old were they? What was a typical like week for you then?
So okay, my first daughter was born when I was 18 years old. And so by the time I was 24, my son was 6 months old. And my eldest daughter was 6. And then I had a 5-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. So I had lots of children. I'd always held down a job. So I always was very good at creating a certain persona, at presenting very well. So not only did I hold down a job, I went from the age of 18, I was a factory laborer for a manufacturing company. And by 24 years old, I was working as part of the leadership team as a transport manager, because I showed up, right? I always knew how to do that. I had like let's call it a toughness and a tenacity about me, but it was nearly always at the expense of myself. And so much of my suffering was internal. My family saw it. So my children saw the worst of me. But outwardly, I looked like a fun-loving guy, who worked hard in the week. I would do 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. And then I would say that I'm allowed to go out and have a good old drink on the weekends. But I used cannabis a lot as well. And a typical day would look like getting up at 5 in the morning. By the time I was 24, when the marriage had fallen apart, my typical day was getting up at 5 in the morning on this fold-out bed at my mum's house. I would go to work for 12 hours, put my head into my work and just escape through work in that way. I would finish work, and then I would use alcohol and predominantly cannabis, but other drugs as well if they came, as a way of suppressing and dealing with those emotions. And that's how I lived my life. So externally, I mean, I was about 5 stone lighter than what I am now, right? So I was just skin and bones. I mean, you've seen the picture. But externally, my life was kind of seemed slightly together. It was internally where the struggles were going on, and I had no idea how to 1, connect with them myself, and then 2, be able to in some way try and explain that to anyone around me.
So the part that I can really relate to in that, which is why I wanted to ask you, is that there can be stereotypes for people that associate themselves with a drink problem, where their life is completely unmanageable. They are not successful in their job. They don't show up well, how we present ourselves, right? But actually, to a degree, you were functioning in your work life. So that part I can relate to a lot. I've used work. I left home at 15, and I have used work as a way of completely numbing out to everything that I had to deal with. So I can really relate to that. And I can also relate to the work hard, party hard mentality. I definitely did that. I did that for many, many years. And standing still was so incredibly difficult for me. It was the thought of stopping was absolutely terrifying. I had to be like this, go, 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 go. Stopping did not come into my equation. And I used to pass it off as, if I'm busy, I'm succeeding, I'm winning, I'm acing it, I'm smashing it, and I'm successful. And everyone's like, Emma's so busy, she's so productive. And okay, I have a diagnosis of bipolar also, but not all of my symptoms or behaviors were down to my mental health diagnosis. Some of it was due to unresolved wounds, big wounds from way back when. So I used work, I used going out partying to numb all of it, to escape it. So then you say you decided to stop drinking. Why did you make that decision, even if you were functioning okay?
So what happened was, is the landlord of the pub that I used to drink in all of the time was a compulsive gambler who had had a period of time of not gambling, right? So he was on his own sort of healing and recovery journey. And he used to share stories of how he used to gamble and why he used to gamble and how he used to feel and what gambling used to do for him. And I used to sit in there and listen to all of these. And I remember like that part of me used to connect and think, this guy's like me. And he stopped and he gambled in the same way that I'm drinking. And he sort of took me under his wing. And the night before I stopped drinking, we had like this heart to heart. And he asked me if I felt I had a problem with alcohol. And I said, for the first time of any meaning, I mean, I used to wear, the way that I drank as a bit of a badge, right? And I would characterize it as something else. But this time, for the first time of any meaning, I said, yeah, I think I need to stop. And it was after that conversation the next day that I stopped everything, that I stopped using drugs and alcohol and smoking on that day, and haven't gone back to it since. So it was literally that connection with somebody that connected with a part of me that had been hidden from even myself for such a long time.
And then in the wake of, and I will say the wake of stopping, because I see that that's what it caused you in terms of your going to the point that you have a plan to end your life. Between the point of stopping and that day when you went to visit your children, what support did you have in stopping all of this behaviour that was filling this gap, and squashing and covering up this massive wound that you had to fix?
So I went, I know, I went to 12-step fellowships originally for a while. So they gave me there was good support there in the fact that there was other people in similar situations to me. But other than that, nothing. I was kind of just really cold turkey with it all. And very, very quickly, my emotions started coming up. Now, the problem is when I stopped drinking and I believed that drinking was my problem, for the first month or so, everything was great, right? Because I've stopped and now I'm not drinking. And people were saying like, it's inspirational what you've done. You stopped. I can't believe you stopped drinking. And I've always known how to present. So I said, yeah, I'm just so happy that I've stopped. But very, very slowly, I started to realize that alcohol was never my problem. It caused me a lot of problems, but it was never my problem. Alcohol was an attempt at a solution, and one that ultimately didn't work in the end. And now that I couldn't use alcohol and drugs as a way of suppressing those emotions, they were coming out of me. And by the way, at this stage of my life, and we'll get on to how this changed as well in a moment, but at this stage of my life, I believed I'd lived a perfect life. Right? So I didn't believe there was any reason. There was certainly, I didn't look at my life and think, cool, this really bad thing happened and here I am. I thought I had no reason to feel like I did. And so here I was. Now I couldn't blame alcohol and drugs. I couldn't use that as an excuse. And inside, I still feel like a horrible person. So now what? When now I have no option. And that's why at the moment of wanting to take my own life and planning it, it didn't feel selfish. It felt very selfless. I felt like it was the right thing to do for my children. I felt like it was the right thing to do for me. And I felt like it was the right thing for everybody around me, for me to do that. And it felt like a very noble thing. I mean, I felt very at peace. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't upsetting. It was like, I finally found the strength to do what's right. That's where my head was at when I made that decision. And that was based on an inability to understand what I was suffering from.
And also, I think when you're in that space, or I know from my own personal experience, I often hear people say suicide's selfish. And obviously everybody is different, but my own personal experience of that is the motivation behind my attempt at doing so was there was nothing selfish in it. In actual fact, I loved everybody so much. I wanted to remove that burden from them and everybody else, and stop failing people and stop letting people down and stop the pain, because I felt physical and mental pain and I needed that to stop. So I love that you've said that, because I do think that, yes, opinions are changing and there's a lot of work to do around people's opinion around individuals that feel suicidal and put a suicide plan in place. But I don't think I've ever met anybody that's taken an attempt on their own life who's had a selfish motive.
No, and this is the thing, right? And this is the thing. And everybody that I've ever met that has reached that stage where they seriously planned it, they had lived with the feeling of wanting the pain to end for a very, very long time, right? So that part was there. But the motive nearly always of everyone that I've ever met, when they actually start the planning, rather than it being just, okay, I've had enough, I want the pain to end, it's actually that point of, you know what, I've got to do what's right for everybody around me, because now I'm a burden to everybody else. Yes. So it actually becomes, in a distorted view, because it is distorted and it's not the right view, it's the way our heads were at the time, but it feels like a very selfless act. And it feels like the right thing to do. And that is why I believe we lose so many people to suicide. Not because, the common saying is they just wanted the pain to end. That's true. But I don't believe that's the main motive. I believe the main motive in most of the suicides that we see is this belief that now I've become a burden to the people around me.
Completely agreed, because I think you suffer the pain so long and you can't show up. You get to a point where you can't show up and put on a face anymore, and you become very aware that it's very heavy for other people, to the point that I genuinely had a belief it was ruining everybody else's lives around me. That's where I got to.
Yeah, exactly. And so did I. And so did I. And so when I made the decision, I didn't tell anyone, because I thought everyone will tell me what they think they're supposed to say. But I had a belief that I thought deep down, everyone will think, yeah, no, you are right, Josh. That's what I thought.
I'm not laughing because I am laughing because I get it.
It's so resonant, because I remember I used to think there's no point in telling my mum, for example, that I'm going to do this, because my mum will say, Josh, don't do it. But we all know she's saying that because she feels like she's supposed to say it. Deep down, she thinks, do it, Josh. And so that's where your thinking takes you. And when you start to see it like that, you start to realize the difference.
Yeah. So you saw your children on that day, and something shifted for you, and you went on another path because there was a realization that there was work to be done. So tell me about that.
So look, what happened for me is I started to work on myself, and I first thought I'm going to volunteer with somebody, and at that stage I was identifying as an alcoholic, and I wanted to work with young people. So I accidentally stumbled upon a charity that I'm now an ambassador for, which is the National Association for Children of Alcoholics, right? NACOA. And I walked into there to volunteer because I wanted to give back and I wanted to work with children. Now, most people, not all, but most people that volunteer there do so because they, grew up with a parent, or they've lived with a parent that drinks too much. That wasn't me. I walked in, I had a perfect childhood. So this, I lost my dad when I was 9 years old, but, loads of people have it worse and all that kind of stuff. So I don't believe that I'm the child of an alcoholic, right? And actually at that stage, I would have had quote unquote passionate debates with people about the whole nature nurture. I would have said, look, my addictions can't be anything to do with nurture because I had such a good childhood. So I can't be an exception to the rule. The rule doesn't exist, right? And like I say, I would have quote unquote passionate debates with people about that. And I enrolled with NACOA to become a helpline counsellor. Had to do a 3-day intense course. And within the first hour of the first session, I had to completely change my standpoint and everything. Because as I sat in a room and looked at the characteristics of somebody that's grown up with an alcoholic parent, I realized that what I suffered from all of my life was the results of my dad's drinking. And despite telling everybody that he went a little bit overboard sometimes, but died when I was 9 and I don't really remember him, you bet your life I remember it. And I remember the hard stuff. And I remember the way in which it wounded me. And I started to realize that I've been running away from this all of my life. And I started to recognize that the reason I had the quote unquote passionate debates about nature and nurture is because it wasn't passion, right? It was defensiveness. Because every time you suggested it might be something to do with my childhood, you pushed me to a place that I was not prepared to go. And I started to understand my wounding. And I looked back and I started to say some things that I'd never said before. Like, I do remember my dad, and I remember a violent, angry, chaotic man who scared me when he was drunk and he scared me when he was sober. And here's the thing. The reason why somebody like me would talk about having a perfect childhood is because when I fully admit to you that what I remember of my dad, I don't just fully admit that to you, but I take away the one thing that I've always wanted. And that is the belief that I had a loving relationship with a father when I was a child. And you can't replace that. We can pretend that we can. I can't go back and be a young child and have that relationship with my dad. And I recognized that day was lost. And I started to really then open up some of the ideas of the wounding that I suffer from. Now, I'm a wounded individual. I believe that my depression that I've suffered with for a lot of my life is depressed emotions that when I was a child, I found ways to deal and cope with because they were too painful to bear, and I pushed them down and I buried them in order to be able to show up. And I start to realize that my healing journey is not about me going out and finding ways to get better. My healing journey is finding ways to peel back the layers that I've built up to see my life in its entirety. And when I begin to see my life in its entirety, I start to be able to clean my wounds. And when we clean our wounds, it hurts and it's painful.
Yeah.
It's painful, but it's also freeing. And I started to see how I moved away from my authenticity when I was a child, how that happened in my household. Let me tell you this, when, I now recognize how sensitive I am. And as a child, I sensed the stress that my mum was under from my dad's drinking. And so I needed to always be okay for my mum. My mum would say to me, this isn't your fault. Your dad was just angry. This has nothing to do with you. And then she would say something like, you're okay, aren't you? You're okay. And I knew as a 4-year-old child, my mum wasn't seeking to create a space for me to explore my emotions. I knew as a child, she was emotionally full and she needed me to be okay. So what did I do? I became a joker. I became more than okay. I was like, Mum, I'm fine. Of course I'm fine. And that was the role that I then started to play within my family. Because when my authenticity as a child, my authenticity is understanding what I'm feeling, knowing what I need as a result, and then being able to communicate that with the people that I care about and within my activities. And when that authenticity threatens the attachment to my parents or caregivers when I'm a child, it's that authenticity that starts to lose out. What I mean by that is, as a child, if I think that by being myself, I won't get the love of my parents, then I won't be myself. So I grew up not as myself. I grew up as the Josh that I thought I needed to be in order to be loved. And my healing is undoing that Josh character that I created and knowing that I'm lovable as I am. And that's not an easy journey, because we're talking about vulnerability rocks on this podcast. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I go back to being who I truly am, that emotional person who overwhelms quickly, who struggles with my emotions, I feel vulnerable. My brain screams at me, Josh, we don't show these emotions. Remember when we show these emotions, people don't love us. They don't want to hear it, right? My emotions feel like a burden. So I find ways to push them down and I run away. And so much of my healing journey since that, that weekend I had with my children, basically all of it can be traced back to finding a way to accept that I'm lovable right now as I am. I don't need to change. I don't need to change. I need to stop being someone that I'm not and know that I'm lovable who I am. And that's, I think for a lot of us as adults, that's terrifying. And that's why we're so frightened of vulnerability, because we all want to be loved.
Yeah.
And I think it all comes back to that.
Of course it does. So I can relate to so much that you're saying, for different reasons, but the same underlying reasons. So the situation was different. I had two fathers, a natural father that disappeared. Thank goodness, he wasn't very nice anyway, and a stepfather who was super controlling, like ran the house like a military Nazi camp, and everything hinged on keeping him happy. And even then, he was never happy all the time. So, and super strict. And so I can really relate to that part where you say that my mother spent her whole life just keeping the peacemaking, keeping the peace, and that doesn't leave space for anybody else other than that one kind of pivotal, domineering person in the house. So I can really relate to that. And I got asked a question during my own kind of work. Who was Emma before she, as a young child, so up to about the age of 8 or something? Who was Emma? What did Emma enjoy? And I struggled to answer that, because in a similar way, I can remember thinking, well, I had to not perform, but almost nearly all of the time, because you're always trying to, everything was so conditional. You can have my love if it's this, and it's but not said, but in the actions. So I really struggled to be able to identify what Emma loved as a child. So what you're saying is really resonating with me. So now tell me about kind of the last 8 years then, and what you've really learned from it in terms of how we can share some information to help others. Because my belief is that true healing starts with sharing, and by that I don't mean you have to come on a podcast or a show and share it with everybody. Like, it's okay for some people, it works for some, not others. But with somebody, sharing your truth with a therapist, a trusted person that has deserved to hear your story, right? But until you can be brave enough to show yourself, I don't think that real healing can happen. Because we, as you say, we're still putting on that show. So until we just do this with at least one person, so all it takes is one person. Your guy who had the gambling addiction was probably your first step into that. You felt safe enough, and that's something I've definitely learned. I've been running my whole life, and I haven't had the space to feel safe until very recently. And that's when the unraveling really happens, right? That's when we see unravel in a spectacular fashion. So, but good stuff comes out of it. But heck, it's not pretty in there at times, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So for me, one thing that I would say is that I've had to remain fluid. Okay, so in the last 8 years, my opinion on what I need to do in order to heal has changed completely. My memory of what happened to me has changed completely, and my story changes over time too. Because look, when I started off at the beginning, I was somebody who had perfect childhood, right? And I believed that. I mean, I told myself that narrative for so long. That's what I thought my story was. And I think when we start to look at our wounds and understand our traumas, we have to understand that it's not all about the traumatic events that we may or may not have experienced. Trauma comes from the Latin word meaning wound. So we're talking about an internal wound here. And some of the deepest traumas I'm starting to understand that I faced. When I was 9 years old, I saw my dad take his own life. And I was in the flat with him when he did it. And because I was so worried about my mum and her knowing that I'd seen it happen, when it happened, I didn't call an ambulance. And I waited in the flat. I thought, if I call an ambulance, my mum will know I've seen this. And so I waited in the flat. And when my mum rang, I said, Dad's really drunk. I need you to pick me up out the front. I was at 9 years old. And my mum picked me up out the front and we went home. At the beginning of my healing journey, I thought, well, there's my trauma. There's my traumatic event. That's why I'm like I am. And that's true that, that traumatic event definitely caused trauma, caused internal wounding within it. But some of the deepest wounding, some of the deepest traumas I've got is to do with some of the stuff you spoke about earlier. And that is feeling like the love for me was conditional, even from my mum. My mum's an amazing woman who loves me very deeply. But the situation which we found ourselves in when I was a child meant that the love from my mum was in some ways conditional, or at least it felt conditional to me. So I grew up with the trauma, the belief that I need to be somebody in order for me to be loved. So I've had to do a lot of like inner child work. The question you asked about who was Emma before all of this, right? Who was Josh before all of this? I start to recognize what I enjoyed was being. was being present with people. I've done a lot of inner child work. There's lots of online stuff you can look at on YouTube. And I had a real experience about 5 years ago. I was doing some inner child meditation. I meditate for 20 minutes every day in the morning. Mindfulness. I go into myself, silent time, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes I go to this space. And what happened was, in my mind, I was me now, and I was walking over this bridge in this beautiful garden, and my inner child was there. It was me in my purest form, and I was, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old. And I ran over to myself, obviously in my mind. And I remember I ran over and I was like, it's okay. I love you. I want to hug you. I think you're great. And I was doing all this. And the childhood me just turned around and showed me this flower, right? And I kind of realized in that moment, I'm not, that validation. I am constantly seeking that, but that's not what I need. I just want somebody or people to be with me as I am, just as I am, with all of my thoughts and feelings and flaws and my whole full range of emotions. When I talk about that conditional loving when I was younger, when my dad drank in the way that he did, one of the things meant that my dad was the only person who was able to get angry. So if I was angry, my mum would be like, come on, don't do this, right? We don't need that, right? We'll try and suppress it like you said your mum does. And so that conditional love meant that I felt like certain emotions and feelings were a burden and I couldn't feel them. And a child should be loved completely unconditionally. When they're rageful, when they're selfish, when they're angry, when they're disgusted, when they're I don't know, feeling lonely, all of these things that we call negative emotions, as a child, you should be loved unconditionally, right? No matter what of those you're feeling. If you are in those informative years, you gain the perception that I am lovable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm lovable as myself. I don't need to be anyone. I don't need to create any kind of facade. I am lovable who I am.
Mm-hmm.
So healing for me is not about finding what I can to improve myself. We talk about self-improvement. I don't need to improve myself. I need to strip back myself and get back to who I am and know that I am lovable anyway.
Mm.
And that's really, really hard, because my knee-jerk reaction in any situation is figure out who you are, what you need me to be, and become that. Mm-hmm. And then I'm very good at getting relationships. I'm very good at getting lots of friendships. People like me very quickly. Why do they like me? Because I'm very subtle to what you need me to be, and I be that. Mm-hmm. So I have all these friendships. Everyone tells me how great I am, and I feel completely alone. Yeah. Why do I feel completely alone? Because I'm not authentic, because I'm not conveying what I truly feel. So my connections are hollow. And I do that, I can do that in my marriage now easily. I can do that with my children. My wife might say to me, my wife's very good with her boundaries, very clear with what she needs and stuff. So if I do something that upsets my wife, she'll say, hey, Josh, this upsets me when you do that. We have a conversation. It's great. It might be a difficult conversation, right? Mm. But my wife knows what she's feeling, and she knows what she needs as a result. Mm-hmm. We have the difficult conversation. We come to an agreement what's right. Mm-hmm. My wife does something that upsets me. I think, if I tell her, she might not love me in the way that I need to love her. And I would hate for her to think that by me saying that, it means I don't love her. And so I just don't say anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, we're weeks in and I've been living a lie again. Mm-hmm. And I think she doesn't understand me. Of course she doesn't understand me, because I'm not communicating what I'm feeling. Yeah. She's asking me how I am, and I'm saying I'm brilliant. I'm saying, yeah, I'm great. Right?
Everything's great.
Exactly. And this is where these kind of traumas play out in our relationships, because in the work that I do today, I can stand on a stage and do what I'm doing now in front of 500 people and tell them all my emotions without any kind of fear or worry. And I do it, boom. And everyone says, wow, amazing. And then I come home and I need to tell my wife that I'm struggling with something. And I walk in the door and I see her and she says, how are you? And I say, I'm brilliant. Of course I am. Right? Because I think I need her to love me. And now I need somebody to love me. I need to be something. Mm-hmm. And healing for me has been about undoing that and having compassion for the man that I've always been and the man that I am today, and knowing that I'm on a journey. And let me tell you, on any given day, I can wake up in complete darkness and get it all completely wrong. And so how does it feel to love myself in those moments? Because that's when I need to learn to love myself. Mm-hmm. And that's hard.
It's funny you say that, because about a year and a half ago, I had a conversation with a very good friend who is a go-getter, right?
Mm.
And over the years, people would describe Emma as a doer. She's a doer. She'll work, she'll graft. You know, I've grafted since the age of 15. I've had 3 jobs. You know, I'm a grafter.
Mm.
And I've always kind of benchmarked that as some sort of success. And I would have maybe 10 years ago said, yeah, I'm into self-development. I'm doing this. It's about more. It's the, you know, all of that.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah.
And this last 18 months for me has been about stopping and sitting in what is. And
Yeah.
geez, it's
Yeah.
uncomfortable. It leads to ugly snot crying often, right? So
Yeah.
it is, but up until the last year, I wouldn't have known what a healthy boundary was if it came up and slapped me in the face.
Yeah.
Would not have had one clue. And I just sit there and I think, how do we get to the age? I'm 30, I've just turned 39. How do I get to 39 and not have the first clue? Well, 38, actually, to be fair. I have been learning since 38. But 38 and not know what a healthy boundary is in relationships, friendships, work, any of it. And I'm not just talking about people overstepping my boundaries, me overstepping theirs.
Mm.
Being the helper. I'm helping. No, you're not, Emma. You're enabling. You're enabling bad behavior to continue. Like, not the first clue. And it just blows my mind. And I love the fact that you're working with kids, because even around sexual boundaries, physical boundaries, everything, all of it, if there had been a bit more emotional awareness and education through my childhood, and if I'd been able to look up to an adult and see at least one boundary exist, there were none. Zero, right? Zero. Then I wouldn't change one thing that's happened to me or around me, because I really believe that I'm coming out a better person for all of it. And hopefully I'll go on to be a more sort of emotionally aware parent when the time comes for me. But I do think that I would have had better tools. So I'm super passionate about connecting with people who are passionate about educating children around emotions, because I believe it will save some big traumas for them, because they will have boundaries, they will have emotional awareness, they'll be able to identify more than 5 emotions at the age of 38. Do you know what I mean? Angry dad, you know. They'll be able hello, you know, there's so many. I just blew my mind. Blew my mind. So I love that this is part of what you're doing now, and I'd love to hear more about it.
So I've always been, you know, I wanted to get into schools, because, you know, I had that realization when, you know, for me, I guess in a way, I was lucky to have it at 25 years old, right? And I just thought, why have I had to go down this path for somebody to tell me that actually, Josh, you know what, with what you went through, you should feel a bit sad and a bit disgruntled, right? Why didn't anybody tell me that when I was younger? And the reason was because when I was a child and I went to school, it was all about my behavior. It was all about managing my behavior. And of course, my behavior was erratic, right? I was wounded. I was traumatized. And so I was acting that way, you know, being rageful and not being able to concentrate in lessons. Of course I was, all of those things. And so I wanted to, you know, I when I first started my business, I wanted to make sure that, you know, a high percentage of it was going into schools. And mixing with young children. And so I've done lots of different workshops and stuff like that. I do workshops with within senior schools, right down into primary school. So I do some like, I call it being your best self, when I work with 5 and 6 years old. And we do just stuff around, I talk about a difficult home. So I say, you know, I noticed at a certain age that my house seemed like it was slightly different to my friends. I don't go into detail, but I just say that. And I say, and then, you know, I recognize that it wasn't anything to do with me, and everybody lives different lives and all that stuff. And then I talk about how our emotions are signals. And I say there's no negative emotions. They're all just signals. Sadness is not negative. Sadness is sometimes difficult, but there's no shame in it. There's nothing wrong with crying, no more than there is with laughing. And so we do some of that stuff when I work with the younger people. And then I work with a couple of local schools, senior schools, where I work with predominantly young boys, but there's a few young girls as well. And I do one-on-one work with them. And this is young people that are on the brink of being excluded. And I help them to explore the reasons why they might be acting out in the ways that they do. And I can tell you that every single one of them, without exception, is sensitive. And what they're doing is reacting to their sensitivity in the only way that they know how. So they're getting angry in a lesson. Of course they are. They're overwhelmed. They don't want to put their hand up and say to their teacher, oh, my body's going all crazy. I feel really, really anxious and scared. And of course, they're made to sit at the front. So now they've got 30 people behind them, which is making them
all
even
looking.
more, all looking at them.
Oh.
And they're trying to gain control of the situation, but they can't, right? And so they get angry and they get themselves thrown out of the lesson. And so I work with them to help them to understand what's going on before. I don't believe in anger management. I believe once you get angry, you're angry. Why should we manage that? Our body is trying to tell us something. So what's it trying to tell us? Let's go further. Let's look at the anxieties before. Let's look at our sensitivities. What strategies can we put in place for us to be able to find out what we need? Because in my life today, if you said to me, tomorrow you're going to have to go and sit in 6 different classes for 1 hour with 30 people, and you'll be at the front with 30 people behind you, I would say to you, I'm not going to do it because it wouldn't be worth my sanity. So, and if you said, well, you're going to have to do it, I'd say, okay, but I need to make sure I've got some strategies in place. And then we start looking at between lessons. What do I do? How do I recuperate? How do I find ways to deal with that anxiety and all of that stuff? So I'm, that's probably the most passionate thing I am about what I do. And that's about, I told you that my healing work is peeling back the layers, and the work with young people is about trying to not build those layers up so they don't have to do the real deep peeling back work that we have to do when we're older.
I know.
Yeah.
Isn't it mad? I think the world is changing though, and people are slowly becoming more aware of these things. So, the more people like you in the world there are, the better, because then the younger people stand a better chance of not just learning how to add up and tie their shoelaces, but actually identify some emotions, know what to do with them, know what they need. I feel, I fear, I need. I'd never even thought about those things. What do I need? Who am I? Just have a clue. Oblivious till nearly 40. I mean, my goodness. So I just think it's fabulous that you're in this space, and the world definitely needs more people like you doing this stuff. So I think for today, I think that's good. I'd love to do a second part with you at some point down the line and pull apart some more stuff, some more emotional stuff. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about today?
No, I think it would. I'm with you. I think a second one would be good. We sort of like pulled apart maybe the story and looked at what healing consists of. We could probably do another 3 hours on exactly what that looks like and some of the methodology and.
I'd definitely like to talk to you more about what you've done along the way that's helped you.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk through all the different options, the options that you've been exposed to, and I'd love to thrash that out with you for people to hear, because some ways suit some people and some not so much. But there's so many options out there and so many different routes. There's no one way of healing.
No.
So I'd love to talk that through with you more.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to understand that it's different for everybody, and it's about finding what works for you, right? So I think that, listen, I think that would be good. We've sort of done this now. You know the story, the journey, you know who I am, and then maybe there's another episode, a part 2, where we really dive into some of that stuff. I think it'd be good.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you.
Cool.